let's make sure that the live stream is going. It says it's upcoming, which probably means it's going to start streaming in a second. It looks like we're probably live. All right. So last week or last episode, the objective was to talk about coding a service mesh gateway, which is fundamental to any enterprise and startup, and looks something kind of like this, where you have, in this case, in the API icon distributes HTTP requests to a whole bunch of microservices, which is a far more manageable way to build out an ecosystem. And it's been a practice that's probably been going on for about 10 years or more now. And then we dug into using a server cache lookup table, which internally looks now something like this, which has where the server is being hosted and the port, and then that port hosting is able to kind of take that incoming request from the gateway. So the service mesh talks to one gateway, and then the gateway determines a matching between the port a particular service is hosted on and what the incoming DNS of the HTTP request is and where to then send that request to in a forward proxy. So that was one objective. And the other objective was to use NGrok to create local tunnels through this diagram. So one method is that it's just going through DNS and then dispatching to localhost. And then the other method is that it's using DNS to talk over an SSH local tunnel to then the service, which can or may be hooked up through DNS in some kind of shape or fashion. And so that has been accomplished here, so that when the server status changes in the particular process, it creates a tunnel. And so we should be able to see now, although I'm not totally satisfied. So it's using this toSlug method, and if I were to go to it, toSlug. So there, that's what needed to change. So in other words, what it's doing here is it's saying that if it has the microcloud local name, so last week the case, or last episode the case was adding microcloud local name. This is just an object lookup helper. If that doesn't exist, it just defaults to a slugified version of the name. In the world of DNS, the more nested that you are in subdomains, you tend to have to regenerate certificates, so HTTPS becomes compromised. So it's often easier to just take this name. Another format of this name would be, let's say if there's a group name and it was like that, you kind of want to strip away that character, and you want to turn that character into a hyphen. So if we look at this sassworks.io example, there's no pre-configuration, but because it's sassworks.io, we would hope that it becomes available not over this without spaces version, but we want it to become available with this hyphen version, which I don't know what it's doing. I did add a message right here, which still looks wrong. So let's fix it again. Test. Okay, good. The audio looks like it's working. I'm wearing my Wayne outfit, Wayne's World. It's my cheap and easy Halloween costume. It is Halloween today, or on Monday, technically, I believe. And I got dressed up, and my dog is dressed up. And I just wanted to get a live stream in and some progress done. So this regex is basically saying if it's not we can even do uppercase, that's fine. If it's not one of these, then just delete the character. So with this, oh, and I think, so that was correct. And I guess the other thing that we want to probably do before that regex then is something like that. And I don't really want to deal with like the group name stuff yet, but that's effectively what it should be. So the other thing I was testing since last time is that, and this looks wrong. Why is that so wrong? So this brought down. I've been testing the the server cache, which is supposed to be reliable, because without it you can't really do reliable server lookup. And so, for instance, a case that just got tested was taking down one of the servers. Evidently brought down this mikewit.com, which is not the case. That thing is online, but there's some redundancy built in. One of the most important things that I can think about that I said last time was in regards to redundancy. Um, Sometimes when you're testing space, you can unit test your way through so much, but once you start integrating a lot of different things that's asynchronous, your edge cases start to become unpredictable. And so what you want instead is redundancy. And there's an important caveat to that, which, oh, that's so bad. The important caveat to redundancy, and let's go ahead and just test something here. There should be a health check endpoint, and so that perhaps still looks like a bug. So that's probably a subject of things to fix today. So when it comes to adding redundancy, what you don't want to do is clutter your code base with a bunch of like asynchronous operations trying to patch up behavior that you really should have just unit tested as best as you could. And the reason is that you're going to make debugging a much more painful, and sometimes you'll make it a nightmare type of situation to debug. But in this case, I tried to, since last time and now, so the NGrok thing, evidently, well, I haven't really proved that it works. But the NGrok works. I made some improvements to the caching, but evidently the caching is not working since it erroneously took off mikewit.com from said cache. So, what we reliably can see is if we boot up this server, and I also, because I actually failed to stream last time. Okay, there, the server looks like it's online. Server cache looks like it. Here, let's see what the server cache. Let's get out of that. Server status. Okay, so at least it brought it online accurately, but what I don't like is that it took this server down. So, so I added the NGrok, and we can go ahead and test that change right there. It should now have the proper, it should turn periods into hyphens. So that I think is going to work for us, which is nice. And to bubble this back up to the bigger picture, the idea is that when you're embarking on creating something as complex as a service mesh, everybody in the industry tends to know that Kubernetes is, and I don't really hear as much stuff about Docker Swarm, but everybody tends to regard Kubernetes not as an anti-pattern, but extraordinarily complex. Much more complex than the economics of how readily people tend to recommend it. And gateways tend to be one of the gateways tend to be a core part of Kubernetes, or even if you're using Lambdas and serverless, gateways play a role. And one of the themes I touched on last time is you're always looking for ways to get your infrastructure up in the simplest way possible. And here, there's this system of having the NGrok tunnel online. This is like we can call this like step one. I'm eagerly curious if this works or not, or if I think here it was something like it needs to be this link, which could just be a matter of it's not redirecting properly. Okay, good. So NGrok, that piece seems like it's going okay, but here we have asynchronous writes to a single file. There's some file locking going on, but why the hell it has deleted this, I just don't know. So we can try to replicate this by taking the server down. Looks like there's no cache write, which is weird. Um, it seems like it had an error that it threw right here. So this makes sense. It was basically saying that the the CWD did not exist. So there's nothing to go offline with. This is in the go offline function, which is supposed to remove an entry from this cache file, which that makes sense and is fine. Again, that's kind of weird. That's really, really weird. So it's getting, I saw this error last time. NGrok tunnel, awesome. So it gets here and it says that there's some issue with locking. So it gets here to go online. And I guess that's through this watcher. So I added 2 checks since last time. So it's really hard to like if you often in computing, it whether it is in real time network sessions or in this case, like let's say real time monitoring, we tend to think about in paradigms of push and pull. And so in a pull methodology, you would think of like a polling would be your standard pattern where, let's say, if you wanted to, you could pull Wikipedia, let's say, um, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a not negative world event, and let's say like Santa Claus was coming to town, as positive as I can make it, and you wanted to check the Wikipedia page of like where Santa Claus was, and you wanted to check when Wikipedia was updated, you could pull it every day or hour, and that would be a pull. And an alternative to that would be that you could inform Wikipedia to push a notification to your, let's say, network endpoint um, when the article was updated. So I think that the going back to the example of, or sorry, going back to the case at hand of caches, and somehow it seemed to miraculously do great things here. And that's great. I love to see that. And so it's worth talking about how did that just happen. Um, and I made the decision to do 2 things in the file. So first of all, there's this watcher. Chokodar is the underlying, well, I guess I've wrapped Chokodar in this watchers class file. So what it's doing is it's watching the cache file for changes. So if you're the mail server and the payment server goes online and writes to the cache file and you're the mail server, um, you want to know when that cache file has been updated, um, which could be relevant for any number of reasons. But in particular, I'm coding a redundancy in here. So I mentioned in last live stream to code redundancy when your unit test space isn't going to capture what the integration behavior looks like, and you have to be. I have, and now I'm caveating that and saying you have to be very careful about how you code redundancy because you can make your code base into a mess. Because if you code too many layers of redundancy, it'll be very hard to tell why some behavior has occurred. Um, and in this case, what I'm sort of saying is that there's 2 things that are going on. There's one is that there's this invalidate function, and invalidate basically says like for some given current working directory and process ID, it's checking within the cache a number of checks. It's basically checking that the current working directory exists, because with test servers, oftentimes that test server gets nuked and you want to just delete it from the cache. That's one example. Another would be like in a, I forget the right term, but it's like a tailing PID, meaning that the PID no longer exists, but somehow it's in some kind of a lookup table. And so you're basically saying if the process doesn't exist, the PID that's not listed also go offline and take it out of the cache. And then there's other examples in here where like if somehow there's a mismatch. So maybe it's like a valid PID, a valid current working directory that exists, but it's just not the correct information, maybe not the correct port. Because the next thing that goes on is it checks the port. So it checks the port that's listed. And if the port listed is incorrect, basically it either goes offline, or in some of these cases it goes online, meaning that it's changing it to the correct value. And so that's kind of a positive, or sorry, it's a negative logic, meaning that it's reductive. It's taking things out of the cache that are incorrect versus you're not typing into the file incorrect things. But so in this, where it's saying watch the cache file, when the cache file updates, just make sure that it hasn't overwritten existing information about this particular process. So here it's saying if it can't find a lookup PID, which this defaults to this process's current working directory PID, and the server for this process is online, to go online. That's what it's supposed to do. So that's one, and it's worth looking at what these errors are, because that's going to be telling in a second. So there's one redundancy I added between last time and this live stream. And then the other is this invalidate all function, which invalidate all was like tricky. I was like trying to, so I had something already in there where it was only going to ever invalidate. I think I didn't want an intensive, so if we look at where invalidate is called, I had to look at this actually to like make decisions. But this gets called, I believe, like when a server starts up, and when a server, I guess, is shutting down. And I just wanted to make decisions about, when to call and validate in a way that was relevant. So to go back for a second to the watcher, the reason that maybe is an appropriate place is because you're basically saying anytime some other process is updated the cache file, make sure if I'm the running process that my information is represented, is what that's saying. And that's a relevant redundancy, because you're not really introducing anything that is going to introduce terribly unwanted asynchronous behavior that proves false positives or um, false negatives, in one case or another. You're you're saying that, I mean, that's an okay behavior to be maintaining. This is a little more suspect. Invalidate all is more like you have to find some point in the process of servers going online to decide. Headphones died. You have to find some point in the process to decide to nuke out all of the bad inactive PIDs that somehow made their way into the cache. And I suspect a combination of these is why this became eventually consistent. But it's still kind of problematic. Like, I would still rather see this never get. So okay, now what we can do. There's two threads to pull on here. We can figure out what the heck these errors are. That's one. Two, we can take this this server, the SASWorks server down, and that looks okay. It still has saved that as online. Great. Now we can take this guy down. Now it looks like it's saved again, and now it's what we'd expect. So the thing that I'm remembering out of that is that the order in which these came online was, I believe it was like the SassWorks came online first, then the MikeWitt.com. We took off the SassWorks first, then the MikeWitt. So what we can do this time is reverse the order that they're going online and offline. And all of these things, they'll need tests written against them that kind of reflect. But I think when it comes to writing tests, especially when you're testing kind of more like integration behavior, and especially things that are like highly asynchronous, as the case is with like multiple processes, especially when it's like multiple processes right into the same file. I mean, that's okay. Let's check the file again. And I'm hoping that I'm not introducing anything like crazy or weird by hitting save like mid-process or something. All right, looks like it's saved again. So that's weird. So it just went, and then it did just write it again. So now, then it wrote it again. So what we kind of just saw there was the file deleted all servers. It marked them all as kind of offline, which was weird. And then it brought the MikeWitt.com online, and then it brought the SassWorks.io online, which just what it probably should have been was that first time that it nuked SassWorks.io, it should have not done that. So that's something to diagnose. Like, why did it do that? And in both of these cases, we have an error, which is worth looking at. And in this instance, I believe the MikeWitt.com came out second. And so this time, let's get rid of the SassWorks.io first. That seemed to operate correctly. Now we get rid of the MikeWitt.com. That seemed to operate correctly. And so now it's worth looking at in the server cache. So I think there's this in the go offline function. So I have a couple tools here. So this is verbose mode. We'll try this and see what information we get. I tend to hide things behind is verbose. I tend to hide some deeper console messages behind a verbose flag. And I more looked at this the first time I failed to stream, but it eventually did go. That's good. All right. So this is some TLS information. I think it's basically just saying, hey, don't use this like insecure flag. So this is basically saying it's doing the invalidation, maybe after it's written. And then this is just printing out different tests that it's running, which is like, great. All right, now let's try it here. Let's add verbose. And I just don't know. I mean, I would imagine this process will not write to the cache. And instead, what it's going to do, and this is what we saw happen, is that it's going to respond to the sassworks.io process writing to the cache, and then it's going to bring MikeWitt.com back into the cache. But it shouldn't even get to that point. The sassworks.io should just read the cache as is. So it has that, which is like great. It's invalidating sassworks.io to like double check that it's all good. And then it does the health check. So it could be related to this error message because I'm just invalidating server cache here. That's good. It exists. Health check. This is basically saying 8564 that exists, right? All right, so server cache validation tests right here. So that this if won't match, then health check PID. I almost want this to read. This is a separate test, but this is sometimes there's some when you daemonize, like you also want the parent process ID represented. So if that validate. All right, so we have the invalidate function pulled up. The result of it doesn't seem to matter. I guess the other thing to check on is this line is relevant. What we can do here is this is and I probably at some point, because when I do live streams like this and I perpetrate stuff that's like other coders would look at it and think that's crazy. Why is this guy not using a debugger? Um, I don't have a good reason for it. I oftentimes wind up, it, um, going back and putting the effort in to implement. But in this case, no debugger. So if we go back to our server status, I bet this is all fleshed in. Great. And it could have, again, something to do with this, but for the moment, I just want to see some message or some logging. Where was it? Here. And then we want cdpd, and then we probably want throw new error, and then we want to do stack. Would be like a common. And so we wouldn't see anything happen when we launch this Mike Witt, but when we launch SassWorks, we'd expect to see, and I'm only saying that just out of knowing the context of the code, but we can see it right here because it's running delete on the cache, but it's deleting specifically the CWD and the PID, which is why, like, and I probably want to wait until this process comes online. Said it went offline. That's bizarre, I guess. This is, why would it go offline? Let's try to save it. Crap. Why would it go offline? Oh, well, that's. Let's try to. I think I just had a bad addition of conditional. That was just saying so long as that's truthy, and that wasn't the right conditional to have. Let's figure out how to pause the YouTubes meanwhile. You'd think that they would actually just allow you to highlight text somewhere in here. But I'm not seeing it. Pause YouTube live stream. Again, so it went offline. It's just bizarre, I guess. Um, So it logs the health check result right there, and then in a bizarre way, it's saying that it gets to this line where PPID is not equal to PID right here, and PID is not equal to PID right here, which is just really, really, really. Because it's saying that that's the port, or that's the PID to check. Here's the PID result right there. That's the CWD to check. And it's saying specifically that it gets to this line. That's really bizarre. The only thing that I've got to think of is that the types are different. Sometimes we can just take it offline again. Because it shouldn't have gotten. Because what could be the case is that it's weirdly, like it gets to this line, and when it calls invalidate, it takes it offline, and then it watches the file, and then if the server's online, it brings it back online. Is the only thing that I could think of. And I wonder how many of my friends, like, I liken, what the hell is this? It's a number and a string. So, hey, I am, in the words of Boris from some 007 movie, I am a genius. um, God, this is saying, it's so bad. So, before I like, try to force typecast the PID, it's just worth. I mean, I see how it's a string here, I guess. Has process. We could do like parse in here, I guess. Maybe like, and there's other areas where someone watching this could be like, dude, you're crazy. Why aren't you using TypeScript? And the answer is that like eventually TypeScript can have its way with this. You can do like TypeScript parsing and get most of the advantage without having to compile on save with JSDoc, but I think it's a bolt-on. And these types of errors are obviously very painful. But there's some practices that I guess I've learned over the years that if you're just writing code and you start throwing a bunch of tools at, making your coding practice easier for you, you get like as cache, I guess. I mean, this is probably PID. It just stringifies it. Um, Jeez. I mean, here, sure, like whatever, I guess. And it's always worth adding a message when you do something that it is important. It's always important to like when you discover something when you code, just write a comment. Just there's just no other way you would try. Like you're not gonna find it in version control. Um, just I don't even remember 5 seconds ago where else I wrote right here. I mean, this has process. I mean, check where what that's calling has process. And so I guess I do some type checking there. we don't need to do that, which but now I would guarantee, well, not guarantee, I will not guarantee anything. So now the idea should be we bring this back online and we will not see the going offline message. You know, with some level of certain accuracy, I suppose. Yeah, I don't see the going offline message. So now if we bring this guy online, the SassWorks site, I can save it. MikeWit is online. We therefore should not see the um, the all of this when it the only reason that it kind of like puts everything on one line is this is when I save it in Visual Code, it auto formats it. Um, so that's how we're able to know it updated. And so here, it's not producing that kind of bug, which is really important just because even if it's not like a ton of downtime, it's like blips of downtime um, that you just don't want. Because in other words, I will probably cover this in a later stream that's pretty soon and upcoming. But the idea being that we want this cache to be reliable. It's because from some front end, you're going to want to, again, going back to this service mesh diagram, you want to be able to always know where your payment server or email server is at. You don't want, even whatever the lapse was, 60 milliseconds of downtime. Um, just because like it, you can't really foretell how frequently that thing is coming down or being updated, or if some other server that's is what it seemed like if some other server was being updated, bring everything down and until they all listened for that rewrite, and then they would bring it back online. So I think this caching adventure has been just a matter of solving little tiny details like this, but also adding in the redundancy. And probably the only other thing I would do is that when it comes to actually writing tests, I might deliberately, I have a flag, which is also worthwhile for probably any code base, is test env, I think is the if I search that in test env. So I have this in test environment um, function, which I had thought, here, maybe that's it, in file system test env. So in some particular places, I'm doing things only in a testing environment. So I might remove some of the redundancies for testing environments and then re-add the redundancies. You're obviously creating some kind of diff space where maybe your redundancy is creating an error. So long as you test it, play around with it, and the logic seems good, I think you're usually safe. But that way you're still writing integration tests against something that's like clean. And then that way you're being a little bit more measured about how you add in redundancy. Because again, like you just microphone died again. You just don't want to be adding uh redundancy just because you're failing to write adequate tests or write clear code. But when it comes to like keeping systems online, I mean, I think having the redundancy is, kind of like a 5% edge case fallback. But it often, when it comes to production servers, it is that 5% edge case that is the difference between a 95% uptime and like a 99.9% uptime, which makes all the difference. I'm probably going to cut it there. I guess compared to last time, this is only a 40-minute. This is maybe like half, well, yeah, maybe about half the duration of last time. I would anticipate between now and next time, there's not really the only other places to go with this, I mean, I would kind of start to feel confident based on what I had just run in terms of tests, that this code is working, as it should be. I think that there's some basic tests to write against this, which include maybe running 3 different servers and then bringing them offline in different patterns, and then verifying that the information is still correct. Um, and then the other test case is to try to there's kind of a in that invalidate function, there's a way of checking. So if like somehow the let's say SAS works, let me think about how this, if somehow this winds up with like port information that's correct, but I believe belongs somewhere else, it's supposed to just self-heal. So that's another test to add. Then once that's done, I think it's pretty safe. And once those tests are passing, it's pretty safe to write an API against this so that every service in the service mesh is able to know where other services are. And that becomes a precursor to, instead of having a gateway, which requires actual proxying logic, um, you're able to just talk to those servers directly. And again, that's kind of a messaging of redundancy. But I think the other theme that I touched on last live stream, it was you're always looking for your closest path to production, and you want multiple ways to bring your system online, because you're just not always going to have the ability to test everything at once, and you have to break things down into pieces, which is true of anything in life. But especially when it comes to deploying a service mesh, or a bunch of different services, I think in this case, was talked about last live stream, but relevant still, is having that lookup table. You could just have a flat gateway that, the services talk to the gateway, and then there's only one process talking to a flat file, for instance. But in order to get to that space, you're having to reliably have this gateway online, and it's kind of a black box connection between the services and the gateway. And you're still dealing with the same asynchronous problems. So it's often better to, take kind of larger, integrated systems, and break it down, even if you're adding redundancy, but just to test it in ways that are kind of minimal cost to bring the system online, um, because you're kind of you can be reliant later on, like when coding this gateway, that flat file is always going to be up to date, with whatever the local server information is, and to kind of read out, what your different edge cases are. I mean, your main, I think, from my brief readings of like blogs about Unix process management, I mean, one of the main things you want to prevent is having a process that's just like listening on a port and you've lost track of that server. So as a for instance, having that like file watcher on the cache where the server is able to have that opportunity to say, no, hey, I'm still online. That's important. Just like it's important to have a mechanism that almost like as a routine job runs through that cache file and then deletes any false records of servers that may have failed to deregister themselves properly. Um, and that all those event driven, let's say push style versus pull style modifications to a cache file is like, as opposed to like running every server on a 60-second polling, that makes sure that its information is in that cache file. Which if you did that and you had 30 different services, you'd be trying to grab a lock on a file every 2 seconds, which wouldn't be good for performance. So those are the types of considerations that you just need to think about. And in this case, it was kind of like when the server comes online, you are invalidating the cache. And then when the server is updated, you're only making sure that your information is in the cache. So you're kind of guaranteed at that point that, in the slight chance that your server is not in the cache, make sure it's there, and then there's a hit. But it shouldn't happen that way. And in the case of like the information in the cache um, shouldn't be there. You're only running that when the server first comes online. You're not generally running this stuff um, when it at runtime is the point. I'm going to cut off live stream there and then probably touch back into this. And hopefully the goal is just to progress these tests so that there's actually testing running against this server cache, and then to create an API around it so that you're able to, from a front end context, instead of just making like an Axios or some kind of like fetch request for HTTP, you're able to like specify the service. It's gonna call that server's endpoint to know where the local or the backends are, and then it's gonna kind of seamlessly just work. Um, and then you can use that mechanism to like have fallbacks so that at first you can like query port 3000 directly because it's going to talk to like the local lookup API endpoint. And eventually it's just going to talk straight to a gateway and just delegate everything to that gateway. But there'll be fallbacks. So you have multiple different environments going on. You have multiple ways that the server is willing to bring itself online. And is it kind of like over engineered? Like um, maybe in a little bit of a way, but these types of things, especially because I've just learned over the long haul, having reliable servers is like important. And I'm trying to bring this ecosystem online so that other people can use it would be the reasons to design it this way. So it's kind of an assumption. It means that I could be wrong. I've definitely seen other startups that for instance, code a flat file of like the payment servers here, the people CRM servers here, and it never changes. And if you ever did change it, you're just making like 3 different edits, and you're fine. You never have to think about it. And so that stuff is all true. Um, and so again, it kind of goes back to the meme of like developers wanting to throw Kubernetes at things, and that often being a mistake because of how complicated it is. So, I think, there's a driving assumption I have into developing, and everyone is going to have theirs, but I believe in being as versatile as possible, which means engineering this kind of base layer of stuff as correctly as you can, so that you're able to gain an advantage later on. And so that's it. Just I think I'm here to answer any questions. That not that there's going to be an audience now, but someone may later come back to these videos and have questions. And the point of filming is just to go into what it looks like at the depths of complexity when things are at their most complex, and what it looks like as you start to assemble things, and not from like a background of like you're stressing out and not sure how to assemble things, because it almost always is complicated. But when you have kind of a more measured approach, I just wanted to bring insight and transparency into what this process looks like. Since I think that, rather than me trying to share when there's a working product and it's easy to call other backends like most every other startup and enterprise, to show what the nitty gritty looks like when things are just painful and not even online, because I think that that's going to have the most value to people. And I will look out for any notification to answer questions at some later date. All right, until next time.